Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience and the Australian Red Cross for this Recovery Uncovered webinar, Recovery, Rebuilding, Rumours, Realities and Reflections. My name's Erin Pelly, and I'm the National Recovery Manager at Australian Red Cross, and I'm so excited to be your host today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you're joining from today and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in the event. If you could put in the chat the name of the traditional owners that you're joining from, that'd be awesome. I'm super keen to see the diversity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across the country. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing connection and culture connecting to the lands and waterways across Australia. Before we begin, I've got some brief housekeeping notes. So we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience's website. We'll be using the Q&A feature on Zoom, which is just down the bottom that says Q&A. So if you've got any questions, can you please post them in the Q&A box, not in the regular chat window? And you can upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll do my best to ask a couple of those questions at the end from our speakers following the panel discussion. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts and reflections during the presentations. Just a reminder though, to please remain respectful to each other and our presenters when posting today. There's also a bunch of really awesome links that we'll put in the chat as we go with information about disaster recovery, about some of the projects we'll be talking about today as we go. So this is the third webinar of the Disaster Recovery Mentors, the Recovery Uncovered series, hosted by ADAR and Australian Red Cross. Disaster Recovery Mentors is a mentoring program coordinated by Australian Red Cross aimed at supporting disaster-affected communities, their leaders, practitioners, and people in communities supporting each other in their recovery. The aim of the program is to support community-led recovery. The Recovery Uncovered webinar series has been designed to provide recovery workers and practitioners with insights into disaster recovery from a community perspective. They will share disaster recovery lessons from the emergency management and disaster resilience and recovery sector using a combination of lived experience and storytelling, which is presented by our disaster recovery mentors alongside research, practical advice and information presented by people who've done it before. You can view previous recordings of this series on the ADAR website. So we've got some awesome speakers today. Our disaster recovery mentors, Vicki Edmunds, Linda Snell, and Mark Darby, who will be sharing their insights on the realities of the disaster recovery process in a live panel discussion. We'll be covering, you can see on the slide, quite a lot of practical issues in recovery. We won't obviously be able to get through every single practical issue in recovery, and as you'll see, it's definitely complex. But from rebuilding to legal issues, economic and tourism impacts, and you can see the rest of that on the slides here. Before we get started, please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. Our first panellist, Vicki Edmunds, has worked with the Blue Mountain City Council in a number of roles. In 2019, community development was added to Vicki's portfolio, which also included community disaster recovery. Vicki hit the ground running in 2019 and 2020 when the summer fires hit her local community, and Vicki led the council response for community recovery. Vicki has an ongoing and ever-increasing interest in disaster recovery, and she's now involved in the Australian Library and Information Association Blue Shield Australia partnership, and more recently as a Red Cross disaster recovery mentor. Our next panelist is Linda Snell, who's a dedicated professional with extensive experience in community development and disaster recovery. She's played crucial roles in the recovery of multiple communities following multiple significant events, including the Hazelwood mine fire and the Yarra South bushfires in March 2019. In May 2021, Linda was appointed the team leader for recovery and relief at the Yarra Ranges Council Emergency Management Team. And 4 weeks later, a catastrophic storm hit in June 2021. Linda currently, although it's cusp of currently, leads the community recovery team as their coordinator, overseeing community recovery initiatives in the aftermath of those storms. And last but not least is Mark Darby, who's worked for community organisations, not-for-profits, government, and at a national, state and international level. As a CEO at a not-for-profit in Canberra, the 2003 bushfires highlighted the need to scan 60 years of organisational history and develop electronic backup of both operational and business continuity plans. Following the 2018 Tathra fire, Mark became a member of the Community Reference Group executive. With the Tathra Chamber of Commerce, he developed a project funded by the New South Wales Office of Emergency Management that supported the recovery and future preparedness of businesses in the area with a specific focus on tourism. It followed the community recovery experience of 21 businesses in the area for 18 months. The Tathra Sapphire Coast Tourism Resilience Project won the 2019 New South Wales Resilient Australia Award for Business. Mark has since developed and coordinated a couple of recovery projects focusing on environmental and tourism recovery, such as the Wharf to Wharf Walk and the local economic recovery with the Tathra Safer Pathways project. And in 2020, he coordinated an economic recovery forum in Mallacoota as part of his role as a Red Cross recovery mentor. Thanks all for joining us today. So Vicki, I've got a few questions. I'm gonna shoot to you first. You're an experienced librarian working as the manager of community and library with the Blue Mountains City Council for over 20 years. When community development was added to your role, it meant you were also responsible for community disaster recovery. How did the Black Summer bushfires and the Megalong Valley landslide impact your role, and how did you respond?
So yes, it was quite a surprise for me to realise that once I had the word community in my title, I then also took on the role of community recovery manager. So the first thing that I did when I realised that the Black Summer bushfires were actually going to impact our local government area, I touched base with the previous bushfire recovery manager who still worked with our council, got a very, very quick briefing about how he ran his recovery, and then thought, well, how will this relate to these communities? Because Mount Wilson and Megalong Valley are quite remote communities. They're separated from our main towns, and they were going to do recovery quite differently to anywhere else. We did lose houses in that Black Summer bushfire, and it was really important to actually get on the ground really quickly and work out what their recovery needs were. We realised when we visited within 48 hours of the fire going through that it was actually someone to listen to them, someone to help them find alternate accommodation, and counselling, definitely long-term counselling. So that was when I then took up the role of trying to get on the ground counselling for these very resilient and hardworking communities, but a very specific kind of counselling for them, because they weren't going to be somebody that would go to the doctor and just talk about their needs and wants and fears. They actually needed very specific counselling. So liaising with different levels of government, working with local community sector. So I worked with Chris Newton, who was then the chair of our local health and wellbeing subcommittee. So we met very quickly and set up connections with our own community groups. And I just used the groups that we already had at our fingertips, people and organisations that had gone through previous bushfires. I didn't pretend to be the expert. I was led by others and really listened to them, listened to the community, and put in place what I thought they might need. And then that's exactly the same as what I did for Megalong Valley, which recently just had a landslip, and they lost their one sealed road in and out of the Megalong Valley, subsequently cutting off 200 people that were permanently living in the valley. Visitors to the area were evacuated by very rough fire trails. So we did get the visitors out within 48 hours, but then you're left with a whole community still living in their homes, still living their life with no food supplies and no stock supplies. So we walked into the valley and listened to their needs, and then arranged to get food and stock supplies delivered via helicopter, which is a whole new skill set for me. I'll leave it there. That's a lot.
Food and supplies delivered by helicopter. After walk. Did you actually walk in?
We did walk in because the landslide had taken out the road. It really left maybe a metre towards the cliff that was considered safe. We walked across, and my director came with me. She didn't ask me to do anything that she wasn't prepared to do herself. And we did that under the engineer's supervision, and we walked across the landslide. And then so it was probably about a 15-minute walk into the valley. And then we were met by residents on the other side who were using their own petrol. So that was the other thing. We had to make sure that there was enough petrol and diesel for these people to still move around the valley to swap supplies with each other. And look, they were an amazing, resilient community. I want to just point out that they didn't have any waste services for probably 3 months. And we set up waste dumping points at the local community hall and they recycled everything. So they didn't take any of the recycling. It was really only the waste that they couldn't do anything else with. But they also set up a composting section so people with chickens could come and take all of the feed for their chickens back to the farm. So they really, really recycled amongst themselves, so that the only things that had to be taken out by helicopter or small trucks were the things that just could not be used in any other way.
Wow. So the chickens did.
The chickens did well.
Got a good feed. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Vicki. Linda, I'm wondering if you've had to walk into across a engineer supervised landslide. You've had personal and professional experiences in the recovery and rebuilding of a number of communities after the disasters, such as I said before, Hazelwood Mine Fire, Yarra South, and Mallacoota. What did you experience in each of these disasters, and how did they shape the way you responded to the 2021 storms in the Yarra Ranges during your role?
Thanks, Erin. The Hazelwood Mine Fire was my first recovery role. I had a community development background. What I learned from that was that there's always this great lag between the disaster and when the government coughs up the money for dedicated resources. So I didn't start that role till a year after the fire. For those that don't know, that fire, it was in a coal mine that was 600 to 700 metres from the township of Morwell. It burnt for 45 days, covering the town in toxic smoke and ash. So once we got going with the recovery team, we door knocked different pockets of Morwell and developed community sentiment samples, and then worked with those communities to develop their own neighbourhood plans and really activate, again, in line with what they needed for their community. That was 2015. 2019, a fire broke out near my home. It got within 2 k's of home, and I was evacuated for 2 days before we were allowed back in. That was very rugged terrain up in the Strzelecki ranges, and that burned for about a month. And again, no funding for a role for a year after the fire. Being personally impacted, what I learned was the importance of having those emergency tubs. So I had 2. I had one with 3 days worth of clothes and one with all my important documents. And I remember at the time sitting out on the back deck. It was early March. It was a beautiful morning. So I'm sitting out on the deck in my pajamas, and a neighbour rang and said, "We've got a fire close by. We'll need to get out." And I thought, I'm going to be one of those fools on the telly in my pajamas saying I've got out with just what I had on my back. But thankfully, when I moved in here, that same neighbour had said, "This is what you need to have in your emergency kit, and you need to have the app on," and things like that. But still, you're enjoying the morning and get caught on the hop. So it's quite a panic at the time. But then I was appointed to the role a year after the event. And what I learned was it was the first day of the COVID lockdowns in Victoria. So I learned that, trying to do recovery in a lockdown was really hard. I'd never worked from home, and I was given my laptop, told to go home, work from home, develop up your work plan. And I'm like, yeah. So it's just so much going on all at the same time. So you're right, Erin, I'm used to chaos. But then I came to the end of that contract, and that's the other thing I find is all of these are short-term contracts. And Erin was right. I've just finished at Yarra Ranges last week, so I'm having a very nice long break before I think about anything else. So after the Yarra South fire, my partner and I went to Malakuta for holidays, and up to our holiday flat up there. Got caught up in that fire, and ended up spending some time helping transcribe the Red Cross registrations onto the Navy manifest to help with the evacuation. And we came home on the HMAS Choules. It made me really, really mad those couple of days. And what I learned from that one in particular, I was at the crossroads because I was coming up to, I still had a short-term contract for another 6 months, but I thought I'd like to go back into the calmness of community development. But it made me so mad what I saw up at Malakuta. The fire the community meeting that was organised the day before the fire, they had all the emergency services there in their lovely, clean, pressed uniforms, and they had, all set up, but they didn't advertise it anywhere. And that was the information that was going to help people survive the next day. They told us all about when they expected the wind change, how big the embers were going to be when they rained down on the town, what to do with your gas bottles so they didn't explode, all this kind of stuff, and it wasn't advertised anywhere. So for me, some of those really basic fundamental communications just made me really, really mad. So then I decided I needed to go back into recovery and see if I could make a difference. Then I came up to the end of my contract in mid-2021, and my boss talked me into taking a job at Yarra Ranges Council that I will be forever grateful for, because I think in all my working years, that's been the best job. But it was a 2-hour drive from home, and I went into the team leader relief and recovery role, thinking again, I was going to learn the early part, not the recovery part. I was going to learn about all the relief and emergency management arrangements that precede these kinds of events. And I was there for about 3.5 weeks before we had the catastrophic June storm, which damaged about 200 houses. So what I've learned through these roles, just checking my notes, I I've learned that there's a funding lag pretty much every time. It's getting better, but it's still not right. And you must, while you're waiting, you must check in, as Vicki talked about, you must check in with your communities, especially your community leaders, and find out what they believe they need for their own community. It's not for us to come in our, white four-wheel drives and save the world. It's not about this. The local knowledge is what you need to really tune into. And again, the June storm hit while we're in a COVID lockdown. The lockdown ended the next day. So while you've got that period waiting for funding, get cracking, get communicating with your communities and your community leaders. Map out where all of your community assets are, as far as what's accessible if you're going to get out and about. And really talk to those community leaders. They will tell you everything you need to know. So we did a lot of program development and planning. And both of those, especially the Malakuta fire and the June storm, the loss of the landscape and the beautiful forests, it really hurts. Well, not far more, but it's a far wider impact than those that have the terrible, devastating loss of their homes and or severe damage. But for everybody that they live in those amazing places because of the landscape, and to see it devastated, like Malakuta, on the way back from Malakuta, there's places that will never ever recover. They look like a nuclear bomb's gone off. And in the Dandenongs, where it had been deep canopy and beautiful forests, there's sky. So a lot of impact around the environment. So we really focused on planning for things that would help people reconnect with nature. And like, we've had quite a bit of rain in that area yesterday and lost a few more homes I can see on Facebook, but lots of people are still triggered by the wind. So, things like bush play group, gardening programs, being out in your communities, really helping to desensitize people back into those environments that they used to love is super, super important. So yeah, connect to people and connect back to nature, because there's lots of research around the therapeutic benefits of getting people back into nature. So that's probably my biggest learnings. Yeah, use your time wisely if you are waiting for funding. You've got to be able to demonstrate community need when the opportunities pop up. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. I love bush playgroup. I think that's gorgeous, and I agree. I've definitely seen lots of community members triggered by the wind, the rain, hot days. So I love that idea. Mark, you were affected by the bushfires in both Canberra and Tathra on the Sapphire Coast, and you immediately stepped into action and coordinated a number of recovery projects. Can you please briefly share how you were affected by the fires and expand on some of the activities that you were involved in for your community's recovery? You're on mute.
Thank you, Erin. My experience is primarily as a community volunteer, being involved in community organisations such as Lions and other groups. I was lucky enough to not have a house destroyed in either the Canberra or the Tathra fires, and luck is the key point within that. Canberra, I guess, was my wake-up call in 2003 with the fires that came through deep into the suburbs there and destroyed so much of Canberra, and burnt up to the back of the organisation for which I was CEO at that time, with no off-site records for our organisation, 60 years of history sitting there waiting to go up in flames. It changed the way we operated as an organisation and the way we thought about things. But when the Tathra fire occurred in March 2018, taking out about a quarter of our town and a third of our tourist accommodation, I knew recovery would take a long time, and spent really the following 2 weeks on a computer and phone doing a crash course on disaster recovery because there was no mentor program at that stage. So reaching out and connecting with people, realising that people had gone through this journey before and seeking not to reinvent the wheel. I was also lucky to find that the New South Wales Government Community Resilience Innovation Program grant application closed the day after the Tathra fire. And we were lucky enough to get a week extension on that, which allowed us to work with the Chamber of Commerce, local council and tourism operators to put together a successful grant application looking at business and tourism recovery and support. And it followed businesses really over an 18-month, 2-year period, looking beyond the basic questions that initially come out from a New South Wales business survey that said, did you make an insurance claim and did you lay off any staff? And if not, okay, you're fine, which is obviously not the case at all, and especially the impact then across a small town. And it also considered tourism, where 65% of our business and economy within the town is tourism related. And like our very many small towns on the coast of Australia, can grow to double or triple its size in terms of population during peak bushfire season. So it started asking questions about that, and not only the reflection on what had occurred, but also the ways to go forward, which, if for people that are familiar, then was very useful for Bega, which was so desperately impacted as a shire in the 2019-20 summer fires, and the depth of knowledge that was gained by the Shire Council ironically set them up well for that period of time.
Thank you. So you had a kind of a bit of a fluke in terms of the grant timing compared to Linda, by the sounds of things. Thank you. Vicki, you've talked a bit about the practical issues you faced in the immediate aftermath of the Megalong Valley and the bushfires. I'm interested in sort of that longer term aspect and what were some of the practical issues you encountered, and what were the key differences between the landslide and the bushfires?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the long-term practicalities, definitely the grants are key to community recovery. So as Linda already alluded to with the 1920 bushfires, all of that recovery time was happening during COVID lockdown. So initially we got grants, we were planning community recovery events, which then all had to transform into something different because of COVID. And I do believe that the community took a lot longer to recover because of COVID, and then also we had rainstorms up here with further flooding and landslides. So it just felt like this community was recovering from one disaster and then going through, 4 or 5 more. So it was a very long-term recovery. We were lucky to be one of the quickest to get a community recovery officer because, of course, with me being the recovery manager, I've got a large portfolio. I could concentrate on the community recovery really quickly and put a lot of things in place and liaise across council and state and federal government. But then, of course, I would have to go back to business as usual, and I then lost that day-to-day connection with the community. And I was very lucky to hand that over to a community recovery officer who we kept for probably, it was 2 years that we got them for, and I managed to squeeze another 12 months out of them as well, so that they really did see a lot of those recovery projects and events right through to their end. And it was really important for the community to feel that they had somebody that was devoted to their recovery, somebody that they could ring whenever they were going through something, or if they were revisiting something, or if the form was bouncing back, or whatever their recovery need was, this was a person that actually really cared. And it was just interesting hearing Linda talk about Mallacoota, because this was a person that had also gone on holidays to Mallacoota and came back to the Blue Mountains and said, I have to help with the recovery because this was a disaster. So I love that disasters build a fire in people's bellies, and then you see this through and you actually help the community because of what you've seen and how you think it can be done better. And that's always at the bottom of my fire as well. I look around and think, how can I help this community? Who do I need to schmooze to get more money, to get more counselling or more money into this community? So I've called myself a pest before, so I really do go out and pester people until I've got exactly what I feel the community needs. But that's because I've listened to the community. They're the ones telling me what they need, and then we put it on the ground for them. And then the Megalong Valley one was quite different because we weren't in COVID. I could talk with the community face-to-face every day. For that first 2 weeks, every day I was walking down and just checking in with them and writing their needs down. And it was, really simple needs to my child, even though you've dropped off all this amazing food, because of his special needs, will only drink non-dairy, non-sugar, vanilla, up and go. And that's not in your shopping list. I'm going, it can be. I'll create that. And, they're the small miracles that you can create for people just by listening to them. And then in the long term, because we knew that the road was going to take a long time to be built, and it still hasn't been completed. We've got a single lane through into the valley now. You can take up to, I think it's 27 tonnes with permission. But that also means that all of the farmers down there who were trying to get their cows off to market before the end of financial year were stuck. And so we had to work with them to work out how they could get their business still working. So, we did use the fire trails. We did use different, smaller trucks. We came up with bespoke solutions for every single person that required help. And yeah, you can only do that by spending time, gaining their trust, listening to them. And that is also quite difficult as a council, because councils are traditionally not trusted by the community. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicki. Sorry, I'm struggling with my mute button. So getting cows across a landslide. So Linda, you've had personal experience and professional experience, and I imagine that's definitely lit a fire in your belly around some of that stuff. And I'm sure there's been aspects of your role that's meant professional listener as well, and professional pest, as Vicki said. I guess across the multiple disasters you've worked in, what were the practical issues you encountered and what were the differences? And I'm particularly interested in some of the work you've done around insurance and rebuilding, and what were some of your key learnings?
Thanks, Erin. Like Vicki, I like the Jack Russell methodology. Just keep pestering people. You've got to be the biggest advocate for your community, and some take a little bit longer to come around. But yeah, if they want to gear the whole system to squeaky wheels, well, you become one. And I'm okay with that. What did I learn from these disasters? I think for me, given the high number of homes that were damaged in the June storm, I had an invite from a pal that was working on them with the Mallacoota and area rebuild, and they suggested that we send some delegates up to the Sarsfield rebuilding. It was called the Resilience Expo in the December. they'd lost a similar amount of homes to Yarra Rangers. So we went up and had a look. It was really well done. And again, this was the first time their community could come together after lockdown. They had it on an oval. They had specialists. So whatever community you're in, check what your overlays are on your land titles. We had erosion, we had landslide, we had bushfire risk, and it was quite similar to Sarsfield. And they started the sessions for the people needing to rebuild with Dr. David Younger, and then they had specialists for all of those different overlays. And I thought that bit we could really use. And I think with all the programs that go across all these districts, there's one of my colleagues says there's no original thought. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. What you need to do is look at what's worked elsewhere and then take that tailored, bespoke approach to see what works for your community and be prepared to test and assess. At Sarsfield, they had snake catchers and dog trainers and Zumba and all the different things on the oval, because it was a fun day, as well as, you know, some of the really things that people needed to take in. But we didn't need that bit. We just needed the specialists. And I thought we could really tailor that approach for Yarra Rangers. So that became Reimagine Your Rebuild. And I know Carmel's got that to share. In the links, there's a whole lot of information about that program on the ADA website. So I'd really suggest you have a look at that. And again, get in touch with Yarra Rangers Council and see what you can use and share from that. If you're living in a beautiful area, it's likely it's high risk. If it's got forests, if it's got hills, if it's got beach, if it's got rivers, guaranteed, you know, disaster's not that far away, unfortunately. When it impacted me locally, what I did was the maths. I looked at how many days I'd lived here and how many days I had to be evacuated. And it was like 2 days in the first 1,000. So I was okay with that. You got to know where you're living and what your risks are. Temporary accommodation. I've learned a lot about these things, and I will talk about insurance in a sec. Temporary accommodation, the best thing you can do for your residents, and this, you know, we've talked about trust, and we've talked about, and I've had one question in the chat. If you want to build trust, you have to be trustworthy. And that comes down to being very clear in your communications about, I use the Anne Ledbetter method, you know, what I know, what we know, what we don't know, what we're doing, and what we need the community to do. So if you don't know, you have to say, we don't know, we'll find out, we'll come back to you. Those are the simple things that build trust. You need to really be mindful that the media are going to sanitize this disaster, whatever you're up against, and say residents won't be home for months. We've had one of our residents say, I wish they had said, you're not going to be home for 2 years, because I would have unpacked my boxes. And they had, the technical term, they'd lived into a very shitty neighbourhood with domestic violence going on next door, regular police attendants in their street. Had they been told that they were going to be away from their home for 2 years, they had a major rebuild. They didn't have demolition. Be really clear that we know from all these disasters that we've all worked on collectively, only a very small percentage have rebuilt, and it's going to take a long time. So people can really consider where their temporary accommodation is. So, you know, it's probably best that they find a longer term rental. Our residents at Yarra Rangers that went into Airbnb accommodation, every time there were school holidays or you know, long weekends, they'd be booted out. So because they could get a higher rate with somebody else coming in. So they've faced relocation 6-7 times, and that just adds to the trauma. It makes it harder for people to recover because they don't have the stability. So I would try and you know, be really open that Airbnb, it might be a very temporary solution at the beginning until they can locate something a bit longer term. As we swing into insurance conversations, I was told by somebody at the Insurance Council of Australia very early on that the 12-month rental support is based on a single incident like a house fire. It is not based on 70 homes being destroyed in the same area. There's not 70 homes, there's not 70 builders sitting around waiting and saying, oh, well, let's all go work in the Yarra Ranges or in Malakuta. They say it's standard business practice that those rental support payments are extended, but it's not in writing. So I would really encourage you, especially once you hit the 6-month mark post-disaster, that you really start to encourage residents to get it in writing that if they are not rebuilt or come to a settlement with their claim, that payment will be extended. What we did early days with the June storm was we got the Insurance Council on board. Please bear in mind, the Insurance Council of Australia is a members association. They are there to support the insurance companies. That's their core business. They will support sessions for residents, but their core business is supporting their insurance company clients. So just bear that in mind. So we ran 2 sessions virtually because we couldn't meet face-to-face because of the lockdowns and COVID restrictions. And then we ran 1 face-to-face later on. Some of the things that we've encountered, what I've observed is insurance companies go to great lengths to weasel, that's a technical term, to get out of paying. They will pull wear and tear claims. They'll do all sorts of things. They're constantly changing the case managers because of the level of vicarious trauma for their case managers. There was high churn for them too, and they would push people to a quick cash settlement. And at the time of the June storm and COVID, building costs and supply chain issues were pushing the costs up really high. So if they could just get you off the books and give you a cash settlement, by the time people could get into the rebuilding contracts, they didn't have enough money. So, you know, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars usually. So what we did was we engaged with the local community legal centre to get people some legal advice on what those product disclosure statements and their particular contracts meant in real terms, and also get financial counsellors, help people to understand the financial implications of what they're signing off. It's not a quick fix, but I think you as recovery workers put in those supports so residents can make informed choice. We also advocated through submission through the Code of Conduct review through the Insurance Council, and Carmel's got that to share. I'd really recommend you read that because this is not an isolated thing that Yarra Rangers went through. One resident, just as an example, they felt they were being lowballed on the payout, so they got an independent assessor to come in and cost what it would take to rebuild, and there was a $400,000 difference. But you know, they had to pay for that report themselves, but then it gave them the collateral to be able to argue to get an appropriate payout. So one of my key learnings is get residents plenty of TLC support early. So we use Rob Gordon and David Younger extensively, and understand that since 2009 to 2019 fires, most people have not rebuilt. You know, we're talking 80% for, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what Vicki has for her area. Put in those supports that help people make informed choice, and selling up and living somewhere else, depending on the level of trauma, creating new memories that may be a good thing, and depending on the level of trauma. Some of our folks said that having a 60-metre mountain ash come through their house in the middle of the night was less traumatic than the insurance process. And I take a lot of merit from one of our other mentors, Tracy Greenaway. She talked about how their community rebuilt But at the 5-year mark, people had sort of self-imposed this, we must last 5 years, and then there was a major sell-up. So, you know, really try and get that information in early. If people don't feel that they can stay, it's not a race. You're not going to get a certificate because you say I suffered for 5 years with the trauma of living here when I should have pulled the pin and gone somewhere that didn't have that level of trauma. But some people will just simply time out. I worked with one older gentleman. They're physically unable to clean up after these disasters, and it's just time for them to live somewhere that's safer, flatter, calmer, that's, you know, got a much more supported environment around them. So those are the things that I would recommend you take on board. And again, to build trust, Vicki's right, local governments don't have as much trust as we used to, but you can build trust by linking in with your community development teams and those that already hold those really strong relationships with your community leaders. Ask for a warm introduction, invite them along until you've built trust for yourself. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. So the importance of wrapping communities in some TLC, local legal services, local financial counsellors, get them on side early. Rob Gordon, David Younger, yeah, love them. Mark, I'm interested in some of the stuff that you did in Tathra. It's a bit of a different take to sort of what Vicki and Linda have been talking about. But I guess with, you know, as Linda says, beautiful places are high risk or can be high risk. So I think this would be, for a lot of people listening today, really useful, is about tourism. So Tathra's got a huge number of tourists each year. And I guess what were the practical issues you encountered during the disaster and then that recovery phase afterwards? So I know Linda's talking about the 5-year mark afterwards, but specifically for tourism, what kinds of things did you see? You're on mute. Mark.
Sorry, my mute again. Yeah, look, I've got a background in leisure and tourism studies and used to teach at UTS in Sydney and had done works with parks and other groups before, and was alarmed really at the question of tourism and tourists, especially for our small town, where for Tathra we can have 3 times the population easily during peak summer periods and peak bushfire season. And the consideration then for, I guess, preparation for any summer season was non-existent. So the sense of how many tourists are in town, no idea. Where are they located? Not quite sure. Are they towing vehicles? Not quite sure. Do we have common maps and identification information, contact information, and neighbourhood safer places across all accommodation facilities? Not sure. You know, if you could send out text messages in terms of warning or alerts to 8 people, 8 numbers that then connected you with 60 to 75% of the people in the area, would you do it? And then all of those accommodation facilities have the chance to immediately forward that on to their current contact list. None of that was in place. So being able to put RFS then and emergency services into briefing meetings with the Chamber of Commerce in preparation was an outcome for us in terms of ongoing season. But there's other questions there that were quite alarming as well, that I don't know if we've always improved on it, is the question in terms of evacuation. You know, does it change things when the largest number of people being evacuated from that area are not locals and they're your customers, i.e. your economic recovery will depend upon those people as customers either returning or connecting with it. And for that recognition, they don't have understanding of local roads or directions in town. So yelling at them louder as to which street they should be on when they don't know the streets isn't potentially an effective thing. The other side that was alarming for me was the fact that in setting up evacuation centres, apparently the local government agency then connects with the state government, who then look up the ABS data for the number of people in that town, which everybody knows is totally inaccurate for that peak summer period in terms of the number of people that are actually there. And when they end up with, I think we had about a third of the number of people in the evacuation centre that are tourists that don't live in the area, there is no communication with them and recognition of them as being part of that group in the evacuation centre. And all they want to do is pick up their caravans and go home and stop draining the resources in terms of that evacuation centre. So all of this was a surprise for me in terms of the lack of consideration for tourists and tourism numbers. Some of that's changing. The other side, pick up on some of the points there that Linda and Vicki made in terms of recovery. We were lucky in terms of having a very tight and very well-connected chamber that had good tourism product. But again, a fair portion of that was about the natural environment and being able to get out a message that talked about accurately that sense of the natural environment, not, in our case, luckily not totally being destroyed, but still being there in appreciation. So reaching out with Tathra, It's in Our Nature, as a marketing campaign that involved locals, talking about their stories as to why they still loved living here was an important part of the locals being involved in the recovery, but also part of that marketing. And also the project I was involved with the Wharf to Wharf Walk that linked Tathra and Merimbula in terms of a walking trail, brought together all the community organisations involved in environmental conservation support in the area as a celebration of the work they do in the community and the people coming back to appreciating the natural environment and in a number of cases being involved in that recovery. And taking it back to the tourism side of things, tourists leave a disaster area, often with as much trauma as the locals, with no support. There's no counselling service for them when they get home. There's no connection to that kind of recovery. So for a number of our operators, reaching out to their customers and sharing that journey of what the recovery was about, how it was happening, encouraging them to be part of it. And in our case, a big event was actually the replanting of Tathra Headland, where over 400 people came and were part of that journey of replanting vegetation on that headland, including a large number of tourists that had been part of that experience and gone through that trauma, was part of that recovery for just not people, but the economy and the businesses in town. So there's a broader context there of understanding that nature of saying, look, that trauma and that impact can be upon your economy and your customer base in terms of tourists, and they should be thought through and be involved in that recovery.
Thank you. So lots of unknowns there, Mark, but also some really different ways of connecting in with people who've been impacted and connecting them in with the recovery. But I love that replanting event and connecting people back to nature and connecting people back into why they love where they live and encouraging other people to come and check it out too. I love that. It's yeah, some good things come out of really hard things. I've got one more question for each of you. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, but just a reminder for people in the audience to add to the Q&A section rather than the chat, and then you can upvote other people's questions as well. I've got a bunch of questions, but for Linda, Vicki and Mark, we'll try and keep answers succinct for this next one so we can get to the Q&A questions in a minute. Vicki, last one for you for this. You've been supporting communities remotely kind of as part and parcel of everything you've had to do. What do you think was the most significant thing that you did and the impact it had? And then with all those barriers around and the kind of second disaster we talk about, how did you go about working around some of those barriers and making them work for the community? And how did you go about advocating for those needs locally?
Yeah, the Mount Wilson and the Megalong Valley residents, they're a tough crowd. You know, they're generational. They've lived in this area. They know the area. There's nothing that I can tell them about their area that they don't already know. So I was already working with a tough crowd. So really it was just listening to them, reaching out, asking, do you want this? No. Do you want that? No. What do you want? But then more recently with the Black Summer Bushfire grant, I was proactive for them and I put in for a grant for each of these communities because we had community halls in both communities that were council owned, and I've put satellite Wi-Fi on the community halls so that when communication goes down, not if, when communication goes down, they've got access to satellite Wi-Fi. I know that the generators within those facilities will also run out because they've got batteries, but those communities are so resilient that I've seen them during disasters put on the back of their ute a generator from their property, plug it into the hall so that these halls become community hubs. So I'm well aware of how they're going to use this space during the next disaster. And when I spoke to the Mount Wilson Progress Association 6 weeks ago, this is what I've done, this is why I've done it, they were just overwhelmed and said, thank you for being so proactive. We've never had council really think about what our needs in the future were, and this is a tangible solution. So it was really nice to anticipate their needs and give them something that they hadn't asked for and that they really appreciated. And as part of that project, I'm also supplying library lockers so they can go online, they can reserve library items, books, CDs, DVDs, whatever they want to read. And once a month, I'll deliver that to these communities as well. And again, the feedback is we are being better serviced by council by you doing this than we are by Australia Post, because all of them have to drive 15 minutes to the local post office to collect their parcels. Nothing gets delivered to them. So again, you just try and over deliver. So under promise, over deliver. And with the Megalong Valley, I just want to talk about one event that I took complete advantage of. This was a farming group, and we didn't realise until the landslip happened that there's one particular farm down there that supplies all of the rosemary in New South Wales for Anzac Day. And because this disaster happened about a month before Anzac Day, the rosemary was being picked and being carted out. And how was that going to happen? So we made it happen, but as part of that, we invited the state ministers, the federal ministers, all of the local members, the council councillors. We got all of them down onto that farm as well so that they could see what a community event this was. All of the locals go in and help pick the rosemary. It all gets bundled up, and trucks and trucks and trucks, so many trucks. I can't even talk about how many trucks went through this fire trail to get the rosemary out for Anzac Day. And, Anzac Day could have been a flop without it. So you really do use community events to get the right people there. We also made sure that we got the roads minister, and we took the roads minister in over the landslip so they could see how bad it was. Thanks.
So getting the right people in to see what's going on the ground. I love that. Anticipating, I think it's a common theme, this listening, knowing community, under promising, over delivering. That's really cool to hear that. Linda, similar question. So what of all the things you've done, what do you think has had the biggest impact on in your work on communities and supporting them in all the disasters you worked on?
I think similar to what Vicki talked about, it's listening, finding out what they want. It's not about what we think they want. It's really understanding community need. And for us, it's been really tricky during those COVID lockdowns. Even once we were out of lockdown, all those restrictions, you know, for the Victorians having to check in, you know, we did pop-ups here, there and everywhere, and people had to check in and wear masks and but you know, we still could offer a place to reconnect. So I think you just have to be pretty nimble. I'm really proud of all the programs the team developed and delivered over those years, and really help people connect to those beautiful places, especially through the nature-based programs. And for Yarra Rangers, having somebody dedicated in the team to provide programs for men. They're not active help seekers at the beginning of the disasters. They will appear really strong, but you know, you're talking 1 to 2 years later, then you need to really have some dedicated supports in place. So we did Dad's Bush Playgroup and Men's Health and Wellbeing yarning circles where the men could come together. We used the YMCA camp for one session. It was called a winter gathering, and they did high ropes courses and sat around a campfire, and you know, really just something special for the men. For me personally, what I'd learned from the Yarra South bushfire was that private property cleanup is a big issue, no matter what the disaster. So I really tried to develop and deliver that. We had different pots of money, delivering it for nothing, using Habitat for Humanity, and then finding pots of money along the way. And in the end, it was worth $1 million worth of funding. So it was always targeted on the most vulnerable people that were at high bushfire risk and had no ability physically or financially to clean up and reduce that risk. Just think, if one place goes up, it's not just the bushfire is not limited to one property. So really thinking about, you know, properties at the bottom of the hill, if they go up, well, everybody else up the hill's cooked as well. So really developing and delivering that, but even then bringing that program to life in pictures when we had to acquit that money, that really landed well, because you know, these grant templates are really boring, and you know, 13 pages of text and numbers isn't gonna get anybody's attention. So that particular program we brought to life in pictures, and then we got a request to share that with the Minister's office. So just be really mindful about how things are perceived at the other end. So that program included community group training, where we taught, you know, over 100 people, you know, chainsaw training. We did tailored 6 Cs, which is a local organisation, disaster cleanup and resilience training. We did white card. We did a whole heap of things. But again, demonstrating that we've been able to secure more money to put into those community groups that have an emergency lens. So yeah, I would really encourage you to think about how you bring your life to your projects to life in pictures, especially for your funders, because you know, they catch on that much quicker. So that would be one of my tips. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful, thanks, Linda. So I guess see it to believe it, whether that's bringing people into the community or making sure you get the photos in front of the right people so that they can see it as well. Yeah, I love that for advocacy. Mark, you've seen a very different side. I'm sure there's similar challenges locally. What support and benefits do you think local business and the local chambers of commerce can bring to recovery efforts? What do you wish you'd known about economic recovery before you started out?
A lot. Thanks. But I guess the key point is recognising that business community and business people, I'd say, is be kind and supportive. The business leaders are not only the ones that are going to keep the local people employed and keep an economy going, they're often leaders of their community already. So they're running a business in the day, then are part of the community volunteer groups, and whether it's the surf club or the football club or whatever's, they're often contributing in a much wider fashion. And the other side for that I don't think always gets recognition from a business side is the recognition that businesses and their staff suddenly become major counselling centres in town, where their business model changes and a transaction with somebody becomes a half-hour conversation while they're buying a paper. And there's not a lot of conversation with the staff to support them in that at times, or the businesses to try and help understand that reality as to how their businesses change and that interaction changes with customers. The other side of that is how interconnected it is. You can't have a conversation about, oh, we'll have the economic recovery over here, and please do that, and ignore the fact that they are people and they're part of the community, and it's an interconnected impact in terms of that. So I was concerned at times when I saw meetings happening over there treating business and the economy as something totally separate, when it was about people in the community and jobs in the community and the impact on individuals. The thing from a chamber side is, I think, the recognition that chambers can take a lead, and chambers of commerce can really give fruit to the idea that you can grow back better as an economy, as a community, and the businesses that either are impacted or potentially impacted being stronger for that experience and journey. There's much more I could say within that. I encourage people to probably look at the Malakuta Economic Forum that put together online. It's available on YouTube and has much more detailed conversation there with Bob Elkington, who was involved in the Murrurundi Shire Council at that stage for the Black Saturday, and also Jan Smith from Ugarri as a community leader, looking at how a community considers economic development opportunity out of adversity.
Thank you. I love that a lot. And being kind, and I definitely have heard that, Mark, about the 5-minute transaction turning into a half-hour conversation. And I think if you're wanting to find out what's going on in the town, like booking to get your hair done, the local hairdresser, you'll come out looking gorgeous and probably with lots of intel, I imagine. Thank you all for your thoughts and reflections today. We've had a couple of questions in the Q&A function. I think the first one I'll ask, I'd just like a quick reflection from all of you. I think we've heard from all of you that, this idea of episodic disasters and having one and then you recover, I think you've all just proved that notion wrong. You've all had to deal with multiple. Vicki, you were saying that one of your staff had just been on holidays to Malakuta and came back saying they wanted to be involved. I know I went on a holiday a couple of years ago to WA and ended up there for recovery after the cyclone. I guess I'll pull into sort of two ideas from Linda McCabe and Deb Borsos around this idea of long-term recovery and, what gets overlooked, and that like after 2 or 3 year mark. And Linda, you were talking about that kind of 5-year sell-up side of things, but then also this idea that after all the disasters and events that you've had in recent years, do you think it's likely that the contracts will end up being extended longer than the short term in order to get more security and continuity to both communities and recovery managers? And how do you think you could wrangle that to make that happen?
I'll go first and say, so my community recovery officer did actually burn out. So they've finished after 3 years. And that was because they were a very empathetic person and very engaged with what was going on and saw a lot of really amazing projects right through to the end. I would actually like to see a community recovery officer built into council positions permanently, whether it's state, federal funded would be wonderful, because then it would definitely happen. But these disasters are they're every day now. If it's not fire, it's flood, it's landslide, it's heat, it's there's hurricanes, windstorms. As it is today, the trains were not running in the Blue Mountains because a tree went over the train line. So it's every day now, and this is not periodic disasters. This is every day.
Yeah. So embedded into local government permanently. Linda, you had your hand up as well. Did you want to...
Yeah, I think some things to consider is the changes to the Fair Work legislation in December, where people cannot be extended on short-term contracts beyond 2 years. Something's going to have to give, because, you know, this workforce, you know, the 10 years I've been in it has all been on short-term contracts. Something's got to give, but it's got to come from, you know, probably from the federal government, because local councils, I know in Victoria where they've got rate capping, there's just no wriggle room in their budgets to put new staff on in new roles. But is there a need for it? Absolutely there is, because there's been no break. Since the June 21 storm, there's been 9 declared events in the Yarra Ranges, you know, plus COVID. So, you know, that's a lot going on, and people just don't cut a break to actually have the time to recover.
Thank you. There's lots of love coming from the chat. I can see I don't know if you guys get the floaty emojis, etc., coming through. Mark, do you have a sense of maybe roles for business or the continuity that businesses can provide in that sort of longer term part of recovery?
Look, I think a key part of it is the communication prior to, so the opening up of communications with emergency services and chambers and businesses as preparation for peak bushfire season, certainly, but in terms of a contact point directly also following disasters is being able to look at networks there. And that's the learning base as well, is that the sense of businesses that have been through that journey. So you've got, I think, as Linda was saying, looking at the way that you change accommodation options. And so how do real estate agents then change their business plan? How do post offices, and you could run a whole webinar on post office response and the nature of post offices in terms of emergency and disaster recovery. So look, I think there's a benefit in terms of recognising that. Just coming back to, I guess, Vicki and Linda's points there in terms of staffing within that, I think there's also that angst as we look at volunteer bases in Australia and community groups as to disaster fatigue. And community groups, I recognise that even with my own community after 2 years and just saying, oh, for God's sake, stop telling me I'm in bloody recovery. I don't want to know about this anymore. Just let us get on with life. And so having that multitude of event after event is challenging then, and a challenge for people that have joined community groups to do what those community groups do, where disaster recovery was never their core business.
Yeah, thanks. I can see, Linda, you've got your hand up again.
For any of the people here that are team leaders or managers, I would really encourage you to put in debriefs with someone like Rob Gordon or David Younger, because most of your staff, it's highly likely that they are also personally impacted. And as Mark says, they're also the accidental counsellors. And for all of you working in this space, your self-care has to be really 110% to just get through. Burnout has a huge impact on your own personal health. So, you know, really, Yarra Ranges Council, the recovery director, used to say to us, put your own oxygen mask on first. and really look at the Red Cross Support the Supporters program, which helps support those accidental counsellors, the baristas, the hairdressers, all those people whose business models were not built on, you know, a coffee, making a coffee and it taking half an hour, as they've helped people unpack what's happened to them. So those are some of the really practical supports, but I would really encourage debriefing regularly to stay on top of burnout.
Yeah, and like really proactive managing of workload and time, because it's kind of, you can't do everything and be everywhere, and everybody has a fire in their belly, as Vicki raised. So definitely feel you on that. There's one here from Deborah Shattuck. Do you have any thoughts of supporting people to transition to new work opportunities through retraining? So for all the people on the short-term contracts or coming through in different businesses, their roles, looking for roles after a recovery, what do you reckon? I reckon people who've done any sort of work in recovery have mad skills. Anyone want to jump in on that? What types of roles or what types of training?
Yeah, I can talk about that, because I did mention that my community recovery officer did burn out. We actually have now a huge sustainable movement in the Blue Mountains, and this person has moved into that sustainability work area. So I do think that there's amazing transferable skills. And so the work that this person's now doing is preparing people for disaster and living sustainably and looking long term into their future. So you're already doing that if you're working in recovery. You're already seeing the future vision. So take those skills and work in a sustainable workplace.
I love that. How about you, Mark? Any thoughts on I don't know, then the sustainability living or tourism marketing?
Sustainable disaster management would be my question, and you know, based on both Vicki and Linda's experiences, share that angst, or Tarthar's experience with vegan staff then doing their disaster recovery job and then their day job for council at night time for extended periods of time. That's not sustainable. And so, you know, support that idea in terms of local council, a local government looking at disaster management options, and really from a community perspective, a recognition that community people have been through that journey without necessarily practical formal qualifications or training in disaster, but with the depth of experience and knowledge and empathy that really provides an understanding that's worthwhile as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Linda, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think community development is a really natural fit for the basis for community recovery officer roles. So if people are looking for training, I would probably start there. Yeah, it's a natural fit. It's just you just had a disaster instead of your normal core business. Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed. On the community development front, there's a question here from Simon Beaumont, and I think this might have to be the last one. But I mean, I think I already know what you will say about this, but would it make sense to advocate for a higher baseline funding for NFPs, for non-for-profits, knowing these disasters are becoming more common and more severe rather than being reactive?
I'd like to say definitely, because they're out there fighting for grants in order to do this work, and it should just be part of their work.
Yep. I saw you smiling, Mark. What?
Look, The challenge there, the word fighting for grants is something that's come up in Bega, is the fact that community organisations flat out doing what they're doing, and then they have to compete against each other to get a grant with the same data and the same framework. So we've got a foundation, Mumbler Foundation, that's in the Bega Valley now, looking at becoming a conduit for not-for-profit organisations across the Shire to share and collaborate on projects together, so that we stop competing as opposed to collaborate, and reduce the impact in terms of the resource requirements on those not-for-profits as well.
Linda, any thoughts about the community organisations having to compete, or where community organisations have been able to collaborate for that sort of thing?
We've had a lot of collaboration with those organisations, and I note Ebony Hogg from Eastern Community Legal Centres in the participants today. I think there's a whole other webinar on grants for these kinds of things, because, you know, at the last thing you need to be doing after these disasters is actually having to write grant submissions. And, you know, we've heard from a lot of our community organisations that that's the last thing on their mind, spending hours and hours and hours writing grant applications that may or may not be successful. So I think even just that whole funding model needs to have a good shake up, I think. Because, like, for local councils, why do we have to apply for a grant when the damage is known? You know, and they've got some estimate of what it's going to cost to help rebuild these communities. And yet we have to spend time and energy on a grant process and then compete against all other councils. I know one of the grants we applied for, we had the epicenter of the storm, and we were told, well, no, you can't have a different amount. You have to, all the councils have to have the same amount. And I go, but we've got the majority of the impact. So, like, how is that fair? So even just some of that bureaucratic nonsense around grants is not helpful. We've got enough to do.
Yeah. So sort of need responsive funding responsive to need. Yeah,
I just dropped in the Q&A for one of the questions was around insurance. I would suggest the link is in there. Everyone have a read of that Climate Council's Uninsurable Nation, because insurance councils will make some of these communities unlivable. They would, in modern times and modern planning schemes and what we know about risk, a lot of these properties would never be allowed to be built in the present day. So the insurance companies will just price them out. They won't cover them. And you've seen that around Lismore, you know, $30,000 to get flood insurance. But that's a really good piece of research that's well worth a read for those that have got insurance queries. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. I've just got one last question, and it was and come from my team's. Has pulled her across from the chat from Carrie-Anne Graham. So they're still working on 2 major storm events in Bunbury, WA, but simultaneously having to prepare for the fire season at the same time. The balance of storm versus fire is crazy and definitely increasing in frequency. They've had, as similar to you, Linda, had multiple evacuation centres open in the last 6 months, and it seems to be increasing. How do we balance this, and how do we get the message across to other parties in our local government area?
For the Bunbury participant, I'm actually from Busselton, so I'm very familiar with what's happened down there. We've used the Dan Neely model from the New Zealand, and big shout out to the New Zealand people on board too, the community emergency hubs, where they upskill community groups who are really actively involved in their communities to run their own community hubs, rather than, you know, the reliance on council relief centres. They aren't a relief centre, they're a very different model. but I really recommend. So he's Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office, I think. You'll find him easy enough. But in the Yarra Ranges, what they've done is worked with, I think, 12 to 14 community groups, teach them how that model works. Essentially, there's a tub, there's lanyards with tasks. You know, someone's on the door, someone's making tea and coffee, someone's being in charge of communications. So in these most recent disasters, where, say, 13th of February, there was bushfires in the west of Victoria and storms in the east. We had, you know, quite a substantial amount of those community groups open their own centres and community halls. And I think the Yarra Ranges Council, I call it their signature dish, is called Power and Shower. It's very simple. It's where people can come for a hot shower, cup of tea, recharge their devices, and then go home. And we've got community groups now running those. And now people will ring the council contact centre and say, where's the local power and shower site for me? They're quite simple to do, but you need to do all of the support you can in the off season and help people prepare for that. But that definitely takes the pressure off. And then as power comes back on, power and lack of connectivity is the big issue. As power comes on, those will wind down, but it really takes the load off council having to do all of the heavy lifting. And it's great because then it reconnects people into their communities and to those community groups that are there for them. Yeah.
So I think that's about all we have time for in terms of questions, but I just want to say a massive thank you to Vicki, Linda and Mark. We've heard about power and shower, the importance of local knowledge and local solutions, whether that's from local community groups, the local library manager, the local Chamber of Commerce, the importance of local businesses as already being community leaders, the complexities of recovery and so many unknowns. And I definitely have not had to think about trying to get Anzac Day Rosemary out of town in time for April 25th over a road that's halfway down the mountain landslip. Yep. But also within that, you've really highlighted the importance of listening, of connecting in with those local communities, know what they need and know how to get things done. I mean, I think my favourite story still from today has been the chooks getting a good feed from the community, connecting to nature in the Wharf to Wharf walk. I think I'm gonna look up that for one of my next holidays. And what was it? Nature play group in Yarra Ranges. So that connection back to nature. On behalf of Disaster Recovery Mentors, Australian Red Cross and AIDA, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. An email will be sent to you once the recording from today's session is live. It'll be on the AIDA Knowledge Hub. As you exit today's session, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. Pretty please. Can you fill that in for us? It should only take a couple of minutes, but please share your needs, your thoughts, any questions. It's been a pleasure to host you all, and thank you again to Linda, Vicki, Mark, Charlotte in the background, and same with Carmel. So thank you all for all you're doing for communities across the country in really hard situations. Be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, and let's keep wrapping the community in with some TLC, because they definitely deserve it. Thank you, everybody.